Good morning, everyone. I know we're excited about having this webinar today, especially with everything that's going on with the country and that the new stimulus bill is online. So I want to welcome you. We have people from throughout the nation calling in today. Our panelist is a gentleman that is very well known in the construction industry, has decades of experience, and has a over 50,000 following of his weekly e-blast, a blog that goes out, newsletter. In this time when we thought that having an economic overview in a time of uncertainty, which is just so difficult for business people, especially for construction. In parts of the country, construction has continued to be open, though they do have the constraints of having another safety protocol for COVID-19, and then the cost of getting the new PPE that you need. In most cases, it was very difficult to get, and then when it became available, it was at an exorbitant cost. I know here in Texas, we had a lot of people who had ordered the PPE, and then it started taking week after week before it was coming in. I think that with the advent of people making masks at home and having maybe not the best type of protection, but having some protection, and then having the delivery cycles with the airlines converting to cargo-only planes impacted that a lot. We do have friends in New York who construction is all but shut down. They were hit so devastated, and the people are in so compact areas. So construction industry, I'm excited and eager to hear what we have coming up. A little bit of housekeeping duties. You can use the chat feature. We usually just reserve that for the attendees to communicate among themselves. We will monitor the Q&A button, and then we will get to those questions as time allows. And Ken is very good at addressing those. Some of the questions will be dismissed, not because the questions are not worthy, but because we lumped them into categories. But we will try to get to as many of the questions as possible, understanding that things are changing by the minute. Though this is not the first time that construction has had an economic impact like this, this is certainly unique to its own. And so with that, I would like to welcome our speaker, Ken Simonson, the Chief Economist for AGC. And as I mentioned, he has thousands of followers and just decades of experience, and has been a good friend of the National Hispanic Construction Association. Please welcome Ken Simonson.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to be back with you, and at least on a webinar with you. And I look forward to hearing the questions. I wanted to start by talking about the survey that NHCA has now completed that I think has some very interesting results. And if any of you were part of that, I hope that I appreciate your having taken the time to answer that. So very briefly, the first question in the survey took place from April 10th through the middle of this week. A lot of you ran into issues of having owners ordering you to halt current work. Some of those came from city, county, or state governments or a DOT, but more often I think it was the individual owner. So a total of 62% of you have said that the owner ordered you to halt current work. And that included those statewide or citywide orders. But 36%, over a third, said that the direct project owner had ordered a halt. Going forward, I think that those percentages are going to keep rising, unfortunately. Project delays or disruptions were very widespread. 70% of respondents said that they had run into delays or disruptions. And the most common reason was just to make sure that no worker was getting sick on a job. So that was certainly an important reason to space out workers, maybe to delay portions of the project. But there was also a problem of not having enough workers showing up at the job site. That was reported by 29% of respondents, and 22% said that an absence of government workers, either inspectors on the job site or ones needed to issue permits, certificates, other types of approvals, that was a problem. There was certainly also a widespread problem with getting materials, equipment, parts, including personal protective equipment, as John was talking about. That affected 32% of the firms. And I think going forward, we're going to see those problems hopefully will abate, certainly on the PPE side. Let me switch now to the surveys that my association, Associated General Contractors of America, has been doing. We've been doing surveys now 5 weeks out of the past 6. The survey that we completed 2 weeks ago, we found that 41% of owners had ordered a halt to current work or to upcoming projects. We just completed a survey last night that we found that percentage has jumped. 50% of owners had stopped work that was underway in March or earlier this month, and 28% said that they were halting projects or canceling projects that were due to start as late as June or even later. So that percentage has been steadily rising over the last month, and I think we'll continue to hear that more and more projects are being canceled, fewer projects are getting started. We were also asking about sources of delay or disruption, and we found in this survey results from 2 weeks ago, 39% of respondents said that there was a shortage of personal protective equipment. That dropped a little bit in the survey that we completed last night, down to 33%, but obviously still quite a problem. And unfortunately, the percentage that say suppliers have notified them or their subcontractors that deliveries will be late or canceled keeps rising. We first did this survey in mid-March, and at that point, 22% said that they had seen those kinds of notices. As you see on this slide, it was up to 42% 2 weeks ago, and in the survey we ended last night, all the way up to 49%. So delivery problems are likely to continue. Not surprisingly, in the face of all the cancellations and the problems completing projects, we've had very extensive layoffs. And 2 weeks ago, that was up to 40% of firms had to lay off at least some workers, either furlough or terminate some workers. That percentage has actually dropped a little bit in the latest survey. I can't say that for sure that it's the same firms, but I think one reason that we have seen the percentage drop is the use of the Paycheck Protection Program loans. Construction industry, according to the Small Business Administration, was the #1 sector for receiving those loans. We know that AGC members, and I hope that many of you also applied for those loans immediately and have already gotten the money. In the survey that we closed last night, 44% of respondents said yes, they had not only been approved for the loans, but had already received funds. And another 15% said that they had been approved, but had not yet received the funds. 8% had applied and were awaiting an answer, and 7% had applied but had been told no more funds were available. So put all that together, about 3 out of 4 respondents in our survey had actually applied for funding already. Now, as I'm sure you heard, that funding ran out very quickly, but last night, the House of Representatives passed a bill that had already gotten through the Senate on Tuesday, and the last I heard, the president is due to sign it within the hour that will reopen that loan window. So I hope if you haven't applied or if you've applied but were told you were too late, you'll have a chance again. We think that funding is very important for allowing firms to keep workers on the payroll for now. However, that's only a short-term solution. So AGC and other construction interests are working hard already to make sure that Congress doesn't just quit and stop where they are. We really want to see infrastructure funding, relief for firms that are running into cash flow problems, perhaps a coronavirus disaster insurance fund, such as Congress set up after 9/11, a terrorism risk insurance fund, and some other approaches. And we'd be glad to hear your ideas for exactly what sorts of relief would be most useful. So to summarize the survey and the situation as I see it now, based on reports that I'm getting from contractors, reading in the media, and so forth, the project halts are continuing, and as projects finish, there are more and more projects that contractors had thought they would be working on next that have been canceled. So I think that we will see more firms having to furlough or terminate people or reduce their hours or their pay. But I think contractors are going to do their best to keep people on the payroll, given the experience after the huge shutdown of construction projects from 2006 all the way into 2011. Contractors have had a rough time ever since getting workers back or replacing the ones who've retired or gone to another industry. So I really think if you can find a way to keep people on the payroll, it's something you'll want to do. And the PPP loans are a way of doing that for the short term. Meanwhile, there will be, we hope, additional legislation to enable companies to keep people employed beyond the immediate next 2 months. For those of you who have been able to find additional work, we know that in our survey, 18% said that yes, they had either gotten work on some kind of healthcare project, perhaps a quick hospital remodeling, a creation of a new testing or laboratory site, or highway contractors who had been told you can work longer hours or you can close more lanes. A few DOTs have awarded projects earlier, both to keep workers employed and to make use of the drastic drop in road traffic. And if you are still doing projects, I'm sure you've experienced a substantial drop in the price of diesel fuel and gasoline that you have to buy. Perhaps also steel or copper prices have come down for you. And I think that we will be on a slower growth path for commodity price increases. But the short-term outlook through the rest of 2020, as shown in my next slide, I think remains pretty grim. That we have to expect that construction will be slower coming back than other sectors. And as a result, the industry is going to continue probably to have to shorten hours and lay off or furlough employees for at least the medium term. I think that the industry will be slower coming back over the longer term also because so many owners have run into their own cash flow problems that they will be looking first at how can they even keep their business going, or state and local governments, how can they make up for the drop in their various revenue sources, and how can they judge what the longer term demand will be for the sorts of projects that they might have been expecting to build. Some areas that we should see a little bit of increase in construction, perhaps a significant amount, would certainly be in the whole area of helping people work from home, spend more time at home. So that would include the delivery chain, having more last mile or last hour delivery facilities, and also we're making much greater use of the internet, including on this Zoom event. So I think there will be more building of data centers, cell towers, perhaps 5G rollout will happen faster. And then a couple of categories that should get back on track. K through 12 schools. Certainly school districts have been disrupted for now, or school programs have been disrupted for now, but once schools do reopen, and I hope it's as early as late this summer, I think there will be the same number of students showing up and needing additional classrooms, modernized school buildings, or in some areas, new school construction. So K through 12 schools should do better. On the other hand, universities, I think, have been much more disrupted. While the CARES Act, as the acronym calls it, does allow for more funding going to universities, it's nowhere near enough to make up for the hit they've suffered to tuition and fees revenue, and the drop in value of their endowments if they had one, or their chances for a capital campaign. And they really don't know how many students are going to come back to their campuses in the fall. So I think university construction is going to be really put on hold for an extensive time, and perhaps be on a slower growth path going forward. Other types of institutional construction, while hospitals have done some emergency work now to deal with the COVID-19 problems, they've also had to cancel elective surgery. They've seen a huge drop in emergency room visits, and they've emptied out a lot of patient recovery rooms in anticipation of having COVID-19 patients. And as a result, hospitals are really suffering financially. Healthcare providers, doctors, dentists, and others also seeing far fewer office visits. And so I think healthcare construction, whether it's in hospitals, offices, or special care facilities such as nursing homes, all of them are going to have quite a drop-off in construction activity. Well, I'll be glad to take questions about other categories that you may be curious about, and also to talk about what we may see going forward in terms of other kinds of legislation. But why don't I stop there and turn it back to Louisa to see what questions she may have, or other people on the line.
Yes.
So let me mention one other thing, Louisa. We do have a lot of resources. I know NHCA does on its website, and maybe we can put up that slide that shows how people can get information from NHCA and also from AGC of America. And I certainly encourage people to contact me. My email address is in the middle of this slide. I'm ken.simonson@agc.org. And as John mentioned, I write a weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction called the Data Digest. And I'd be glad to add anybody who's on the Zoom meeting to the email list for that. They can just email me or directly to Louisa. And now I'll turn it to you, Louisa.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ken. And like John Martinez mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be reviewing the questions that you may have. If you can do so by clicking in the Q&A button so we can see your questions coming in. And I would like to pass it over to John again. So if you would like to talk about the poll that it's been running for a few minutes now.
Yes. Before we go that, a question that I had texted to me was, do you have any specific information on how construction is going to do in different areas of the country? So, for instance, I'm based in Texas. Construction has, we've been doing well for a while now. Construction has remained open for the most part here. But like I say, our friends in New York, it's all but just completely closed down there. Do you have, Ken, do you have any information, regional information that you could share?
Yes, as you know, John, nearly all governors have put in some kind of stay-at-home order, but construction has been defined as an essential activity. However, the interpretation of that word essential does vary somewhat from state to state. Also, the date the orders went into effect varies, and the treatment of projects already underway varies. So Texas and Florida, for instance, have been, I would say, much more accommodating to construction than some other states have been. At the other extreme, Washington State, Pennsylvania, cities of Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, took quite a hard line, and some of the counties around the San Francisco Bay also. Similarly, I think as we reach that turning point and some of the states begin to allow more activity to happen, that's also going to vary quite a bit. So we will see, but I think the major problem is not going to be so much the orders from governors, mayors, county executives, but the lack of funding or the lack of confidence in demand for projects by owners. So that also depends on a regional economy. So Texas has been adding a lot of population, and that is always a big generator of demand for construction. On the other hand, the so-called oil patch, whether it's the drilling areas in the Permian Basin or the oil service companies based in Houston, the petrochemical firms along the Texas Gulf, all of those are being hurt very badly. And so the construction demand that they have been generating, which had been quite robust, I think that that's going to be subdued for a very long time. So it's not just a matter of what a governor or mayor orders, it's what is the mix of customers, both public, institutional, and private customers in a location.
Ken, we have a question from Miguel. How is technology helping in the current situation? What tools, tech would you like to see that are not available now? So could you talk, do you have any information on how technology has impacted how we're continuing to work?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that I think each firm is going to be looking for answers for themselves, but I'm sure that there are a lot of inventive minds, if they aren't working on making personal protective equipment right now or testing equipment for COVID-19. Many of them are going to be looking at new ways that different industries can do business that allow more social distancing, more safe working practices in general. So this may accelerate the trend toward moving construction activity into a factory and leaving it more as an assembly job on work sites. But people have been trying to come up with those solutions for a long time now. And there's so many things that are specific to each work site, to local regulations, building codes, and so forth, that I'd say there's no clear path forward so far. But keep your eyes out for things that could help you on your own projects. But so far, I haven't seen any breakthrough solutions.
You know, another note on technology, there's a silver lining to this. A lot more people have gotten, either their depth of knowledge has increased or they've gotten more accustomed to using it. I just remember seeing people who, at first it took a while for them to learn how to log into Zoom. Now that's pretty much everyone's exhausted of Zoom. Number one, but we've also noticed on the applications that we use, software apps and things, that companies have increased their benefits or their offerings. So companies that didn't take credit cards are now taking credit cards, and even the checks online, typing in your routing number and such. We've seen companies that didn't have apps, all of a sudden the apps are appearing. So I think that in some cases, Ken, as you mentioned, it has caused people to, or companies to ramp up their offerings that can be connected, that people can access more easily through the web. I don't think those things are going to reset back to exactly where they were at the beginning. And I also will say that the worker engagement that we're doing, a lot of us doing virtually or on site, being either in person, but also still having a technology aspect to it. I don't believe that's going to change. Ken, one question that I had text was that, do you anticipate an increase in worker migration from inside the United States, like maybe a worker coming from New York going into Florida or Texas where there's more work? One, and then a second part of that question is, do you see people who are highly skilled but maybe left the construction career behind them? Do you see them jumping back in the areas where construction is more robust?
Wow, that's a tough one to predict. I think what we saw in the 2007-2009 recession and afterwards was a huge drop in mobility. Partly that was because people couldn't find someone to buy their home if they were a homeowner and wanted to move, or the job prospects weren't good where they were headed to. So this time around, while this has hit the whole country at once, hopefully we will see areas start to recover much more quickly than we did in 2009 and beyond that. But I do worry that there will be a second wave in places that open up too quickly. So while for now some states may be looking more attractive, I think I would be cautious about pulling up stakes and moving. But I do think that we will see some areas have more people coming to offer their services in construction. So the workforce shortage that we've been hearing about ever since 2012, that is eased for now, both because so much of the work has disappeared and because workers will be available locally and some of them will be moving. But I do think construction is going to be later coming back than many other sectors. And so that's a worry that people are going to leave construction to take jobs in other sectors. So a little bit the opposite of what the questioner was suggesting might happen, of workers coming back to construction. I can only hope that construction will be able to retain the workers it has. As I mentioned, the PPP loans are helping companies keep people on the payroll for right now. That's a very short-term solution. So we do need to see an additional round of funding, either for this program or other things that are really targeted to helping keep people on the payroll and not just keeping them at home, but also things that will provide long-term benefit to contractors, to suppliers and service providers, and really provide long-term benefit to public welfare and productivity in the economy, such as infrastructure. But it's really tough to say right now how much appetite there is in Congress for doing that, for adding still more funding for infrastructure as opposed to these short-term relief packages.
Another question that we have from Luis is, how badly has the revenue from gas tax, plane fees, et cetera, been? Do you think this will have a short and long-term impact?
Some states have been accumulating more funds. 33 states increased their fuel taxes or other highway funding sources over the last decade. And that happened in many states with Republican governors, Republican-controlled legislatures, even though at the federal level, as you know, the federal gas and diesel taxes haven't been touched since 1993. And that federal bill expires on September 30th. So there is a move now to make sure that that gets renewed on time. I have been pretty dubious that that would happen until recently. I'm more hopeful now. But in terms of where that money will come from for either a renewal of the federal highway funds or to make the states whole for the huge drop in gas and diesel tax receipts that they're incurring now, that's going to be a challenge. We are hoping that the next stimulus bill will do both, that it will find additional funding for federal aid program, but also to reimburse states for loss of highway tax revenue in the short term. Again, the amount of damage done to highway programs in the states varies. We have seen some states, as I said, accelerate their awarding of highway projects right now to take advantage of the low interest rates and the extremely low traffic on their roads. But going forward, I think it will be a little more difficult for DOTs to put out projects to bid, and some of them have already delayed some bid lettings. I think the niche within the highway sector that is at most risk is toll roads, both traditional toll road authorities and public-private partnerships. I know you've seen a lot of that activity in Texas. It's been happening in Florida, Virginia, and then some other states, both with the traditional toll roads like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and then some newer projects that have happened in places like North Carolina and across the Ohio River between Kentucky and Indiana. Toll roads depend very heavily, and bridge and tunnel authorities, very heavily on tolls, obviously, and so that drop in traffic has hit them right away, and they'll have a harder time recovering than DOTs, I think.
So another question, can you share a little bit more about the difference between what you anticipate for residential construction versus commercial construction?
Yeah, I do think that clearly there was huge growing demand for home building, home purchases, and that's really been hit very hard. Nobody's going out to visit a house that they were thinking of buying, whether it's a model home or an existing home. And so for now, I think demand for single family construction is really going to be in a slump. But once people get the ability or lose the fear to go out and look for houses, the fact that mortgage rates have come down a good deal means that people who have the assets and have the ongoing income, more of them will be able to qualify for mortgages. So again, I think the appetite for buying a home will resume. Single-family home building, I think, will be one of those sectors that will come back more rapidly than other areas. Certainly travel-related, for instance, hotels and resorts and casinos. I think they're going to have a much harder time recovering than single-family. On the multifamily side, while there are some of these, I guess vulture funds isn't quite a fair name, but there are investors looking for opportunities to buy distressed properties. I don't think there's going to be much money for putting up new multifamily projects. So I think the multifamily side will be a lot slower to come back than single family. And then finally, an important niche for small contractors, in home improvements. More people, I think, are going to say, hey, I actually liked working at home, not having to have that long commute, or my company has decided they don't want to bring as many people back into the office. So I want to set up my house so I have a proper office, not just sitting in my kitchen or den with the family coming in all the time. And so I think we will see a burst of additional home improvement. That's quite a contrast to where we are now, where a lot of people may not even want to let a worker into their home. But that's going to be a growth market compared to many other parts of construction.
Thank you. We have a question from Miguel. How will the industry handle furloughs today as opposed to how it dealt with in 2006? What will it do differently? I am new to the construction, but earlier you mentioned in 2006, 2011, some layoffs and furloughs happened.
Yes, in that period, and it was almost 5 full years, the construction industry lost over 2 million workers, 30% decline in construction employment. And that was far worse than nearly any other industry and far worse than the nation as a whole. Equally important, those job losses started more than a year before they did in the rest of the economy, and the job gains didn't come back for a full year after the help wanted signs went up elsewhere. So that's a major reason that construction still hasn't gotten back to the employment level that it was at in its peak in early 2006, whereas the economy as a whole was setting records for employment for about 5 years until last month. This time around, I think contractors are going to do all they can to hold on to employees. And I think the PPP program, as I mentioned, and some other devices are helping contractors do that, at least for the short term. They may have to reduce workers' hours or pay, but they're really going to try even harder than they did. And I know many firms did hold on to their key employees as long as they could back in 2006 to 8. But that was such a long period of seeing a decline in activity that it was really impossible. So this time, I think that firms will do their best to keep people employed, even if they don't have work for them immediately. But it's going to be one of the biggest challenges for any business owner.
You are muted, John.
Sorry. We also, we have our poll out right now. It will be closing in a few minutes. So if you could please take the time to answer the poll. We have a question from Victor. Once we reopen America, how can our companies capitalize on the opportunity? What should we do to get ready?
That's a great question. And it really depends on what part of the country you're located in and what types of construction you think you're capable of taking on. Certainly, if we do get an infrastructure bill, that's going to eventually put money toward highways and perhaps many other types of infrastructure. AGC has been working toward a renewal of the Water Resources Development Act, for instance. So that affects another type of infrastructure. And I do think that the firms that are providing telecommunications services, data services, that they're going to be looking to add facilities. But in terms of smaller commercial projects, certainly I think retail has been damaged permanently. It was already in steep decline. The Census Bureau reports each month on construction spending across large range of categories. What I can term as retail construction was down 23% in 2019, and we already had a lot of store closings announced in the first couple of months of 2020. A lot of those stores that are closed now are never going to reopen. So to the extent that there's any retail construction, it's more likely to be putting a new tenant into a place that is closed than building anything from scratch. I think that, as I mentioned, travel related, the hotel business, which was an active area for construction, that's also going to be in a slump for quite a while. And entertainment, that's going to vary. We have to see how quickly people are allowed back into sports stadiums, into movie theaters, into casinos. But my guess is that there's going to be more in the way of renovating those facilities to allow some form of social distancing, less seating capacity, wider spacing, and so forth. Perhaps screening of people coming into venues, not much new construction in those areas. As I mentioned, I think the K through 12 school market, that's one that will recover well. And again, we may see some adaptation, a need for remodeling or additional facilities so that you have screening of students, teachers, others coming into buildings. and perhaps some of the facilities would have a wider spacing. But obviously, schools are an area where you do have a lot of people crowded together, whether it's in the classroom, the gym, or the cafeteria. So that's going to be challenging. I think that the whole service sector, which employs a huge number of people, that's going to come back piece by piece. So businesses that come into people's homes, I think they're going to have a harder time getting permission to do that. So if you're talking about the home remodeling business, I already talked about that a little bit, but things like pest services, those are going to have a harder time. On the other hand, landscaping companies, lawn mowing companies in my neighborhood, they've been coming on full schedule. So I don't think you'll see much change in what happens there. And then, of course, we've seen a lot of talk this week about personal care businesses like barbers and nail and hair salons, whether they'll be allowed to come back. I think the demand is going to be there. I know I'm feeling a lot shaggier than I usually am in terms of how my hair looks. So I would love to get back to that business. These are obviously not big generators of construction activity in themselves, but they're all ways in which the economy will get going, and the spillover effects of those businesses, their owners, their suppliers, all wanting construction. That's going to happen at varying rates and at different times in different states.
Thank you, Ken. I think you've addressed some of this, but I want to make sure that we do the right thing here and address this question. It's a double-pronged one. Do you have projections or changes, declines on subsegments of construction, like multifamily and hospitality? And then the second part of that is, there was already an issue with affordable housing. How do you see that being impacted now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, at least I don't have the confidence to predict how low things will go or how soon they'll come back or how far they'll come back. One thing I look at in the hospitality area is weekly statistics from a company called STR, formerly Smith Travel Research. They get data every week from thousands, hundreds of thousands of hotels worldwide on average daily room rates and occupancy rates. And the drop-off from a year before for the same week or the same month is stunning. And interesting, there is differentiation within that hotel business. As you might expect, the high-end hotels, the luxury resorts, they've seen an almost total emptying out of customers, something like a 94% decline for those niches. At the other end, the economy hotels that perhaps essential workers who aren't able to go home, or people who have been stranded in a city other than what they are used to, or who needed to get away from a roommate who may have been infected, they've seen a much smaller decline in occupancy rates. And so on the flip side, in terms of demand for construction, I think that those more economy-minded niches will probably see a rebound more quickly in wanting to add rooms and do construction than the luxury segment. We'll have to see how quickly businesses and vacation travelers start boarding airplanes and going to conventions or spending their dollars on the upper end hotels, but I'm pretty pessimistic about that. In terms of the affordable housing market, I think that this is an area where state and local governments are going to be feeling the stress, that they have been putting so much money into emergency relief of different kinds. Unfortunately, construction of things that haven't started, it's always easier to put that off than to cut pay or cut workers, cut benefits. And so I think the construction of new affordable housing, of public buildings such as courthouses or rec centers, those things are going to be deferred, and we're going to see a slower comeback in that area, even though there are going to be more people in need of supported housing than we've had in the past.
Thank you, Ken. And this is, I think, maybe your perspective from AGC will help on this one as well. But what can majority, large general contractors do to support our trade partners during this time, or including, the diversity subcontractors and small businesses?
Well, I think to the extent that a larger contractor has ongoing projects and the sub is having trouble locating masks or other personal protective equipment, and the large contractor either has it or they have sources that can get it, that's certainly a way they can help. To the extent that a smaller firm may need help in learning what kinds of relief resources are available, such as how to apply for a PPP loan or other federal or state programs. I hope that the larger firms will be able to share their expertise. Again, to put in a plug for the AGC coronavirus website that is at the bottom of this screen, we put up a lot of information for firms of all sizes on what are considered safe practices in terms of operating a workplace safely, educating workers and supervisors on what they should be doing. And we have videos as well as textual materials. So we're certainly cognizant that, first of all, our membership spans all sizes of companies, and that our general contractor members rely very heavily on a wide network of subcontractors and of smaller suppliers and service providers.
Submit your questions. We have a couple more questions here. Abdullah, are there going to be work for post-construction cleanup in the near future? And, sometimes when work is slow, some of the contractors will kind of do more of that internally. Do you have any data or anything that you can share on that?
No, it's not something I've heard about, but you're right. We certainly heard about that during that 2006 to 2011 period, that at first firms tried to find things that their workers could do in the shop or in the office. It's more complicated this time, of course, because first, if that activity is not considered essential, then the workers may not be allowed to come in, or some of the activities might require closer proximity or more people on site than a local or state government rules would allow. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that.
And then I'm not sure if you have any information, but what kind of certifications are important for installers? I know you get more of a broad perspective, and this may be out of your circle, but do you have any information on that?
I think that's really a state-by-state or city-by-city thing. And AGC does have a total of 88 chapters that blanket the country. So if you'd like to find out from a chapter what resources they have, you can go to agc.org, and you can see right there that, on the home page there is a way to locate the chapter for your area. But no, it's not something that I can directly address.
Thank you, Ken. We also have a question from Paul Rodriguez out of Kansas. What changes, if any, would you suggest a workforce board consider in the current climate and for going forward? Do you see any future new grants for workforce development?
I have not been hearing about new things for workforce development yet, but I'd say the immediate thing is to make sure that any work sites that you are still on, that you are following the safe practices, things recommended by the Centers for Disease Control and any local governmental and health authorities. Construction certainly got some bad publicity over the last month because TV crews were out looking for cases where workers weren't following those kinds of guidelines. We think that most firms have been acting very responsibly. Business owners recognize that they can't stay in business if they don't have healthy and safe workers. But nevertheless, there are a few who did not follow good practices. So for the immediate future, make sure that your workers understand and are reminded of what's necessary in order to keep them and the public safe and healthy, and to make sure that government agencies aren't going to crack down on them. I think while the PPP program certainly was adopted very quickly by many contractors, it's going to be complicated to make sure that the money that you have documented how that money is used, and that you don't get dinged at the end. Because the great thing about this is that while it's called a loan, it will be completely forgiven if you've used the money for the stipulated purposes, which is to cover payroll, a certain amount beyond that for rent and utilities, and a limited number of other things. But you do need good documentation. So make sure that your accounting systems, bookkeeping is up to speed in case you're audited later, and so that you can prove that you're eligible for writing off that loan completely. If there are expenses that you're not eligible to write off, you can still repay the loan at a very modest 1% interest rate up through, I believe it's the end of 2022. So you still want to have that documentary record in place. And I would say firms that have not been careful about writing internal memos and so forth, and recording what they are using money for, what decisions they're making, what their rationale is, that now is the time to do that.
Thank you, Ken. I know we've had a couple of webinars, including we had one this morning that talked about the new stimulus package. And to tie in some information that came out of Stanford University last year, it did say that businesses, minority-owned businesses, were more likely to be bankable with loans if they were associated with a chamber of commerce or trade association. And the data that we're seeing right now on the paycheck loan is that businesses that had relationships with their bankers were much more successful in applying for the loans than people didn't. The information we got this morning, even under this new stimulus package, was that the banks were working. First, they were going to work on their backlog of applications that they've had to process those, and they were not taking in any new clients. So I know that everybody loves the ease of online banking and ATM, but having that relationship with that banker, like in before COVID and after COVID, is critical. It's just more, we've seen the relevancy now. So for instance, our organization here in Texas, the Regional Hispanic Contractors, our banker called us first thing 7 o'clock in the morning for the first stimulus bill to see if we were applicable. And we worked with him that quickly. Having that type of relationship, they also found that like businesses in the Midwest had a more capita getting the, it was higher per capita getting the loans. And one of the things that that they're thinking that's from is that it's really small communities. So the banker knows everyone in the community. They can call them at home. They're going to see them at church and school and in the neighborhood. And so he knows his clients, he or she knows his clients very well. And they've been able to successfully apply for those. And I know there's been other issues, but I would say if you don't have a relationship now, you know, it may be too late for trying to apply for these loans now, but it's never too late to start having good banking relationships in addition to the ease of online and ATMs. Most of the banks are telling us they anticipate this money will run out just for the backlog of applications that they have. The good news to that, though, is that there's a lot of local governments, municipalities, cities, states that are having their own loan programs. So I urge you to go after those as well. Sometimes the interest is very, very low. The paycheck loan is my preferred one, just because if you follow all the processes, it turns into a forgivable loan or a grant. And yes, everyone is urging that if you do get those, make sure your paperwork is in order, because right now things are moving very rapidly, but there will be a time where people will have more time to review those. And already the SBA has made some changes. For instance, they were allowing an electronic signature, and now they're requiring a wet initials and signatures on those documents, which means that you actually have to go to your bank. Most of the banks are doing it in a drive-through kind of basis, so the lines are very long. So even now, they're still, thinking about the future and how these are government loans, and they will be more analyzed when time allows. Why don't you share with everybody that we do have the poll closed, and the results will be shared with everybody. A lot of them are in line to the surveys that we saw before, with the delays and the cancellations. And we'll make sure you not only get the presentation, but you get the resource page with additional information. Like Ken mentioned, AGC has a lot of resources, NACA has resources, NACA partners with AGC, and then on the local level, many of our chapters either office in the same building or have working relationships where they share board members and such. So it is it's a good relationship that we need even more during this time. With that, not being any questions, any last comments, Ken? I think you're on mute, Ken.
Thanks. You did a great job, John, of talking about that loan program and the state and local resources worth investigating. I guess one other that I'm reminded of is payroll tax relief. Again, it's somewhat complicated, but do work with your accountant, or perhaps you have association help on this, but I think that can also help a company's cash flow if it's trying to keep the workers on board.
Okay, thank you, Ken. This will end our webinar. I want to thank Luisa Moreno and Blanca Montoya with the NHCA team. I want to thank Julio Flores with the RHCA team here in Dallas for helping to put this together. And I especially want to thank Ken. Every time we've asked him in previous years and now to participate and share his wisdom and his knowledge and foresight, he's always been very obliging. And Ken, I know you're a very busy man, and we appreciate your time this morning and always.
You bet. Glad to be with you.
And with that, the meeting has ended. Thank you, and check your emails for the presentation and other information.
Thank you so much.